Okay, so today we're going to be talking about discussing race and race-related issues with children. This is in light of everything that's been going on recently. So these are some things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about confronting biases, having strategies for having the conversation with your child, what it means to be an ally, and then kind of a summary of tips and recommendations that have been discussed throughout the PowerPoint. So the civil rights movement that occurred this year, the last couple of months, has sparked numerous questions from children. So these questions are regarding protests, police brutality, what racism is, race-based violence. And so it may be difficult for parents to kind of grapple with and understand how to communicate these issues to their children, especially if the children are younger. So this PowerPoint is aimed at kind of giving you some of those tools and strategies to have that discussion. So, first of all, why are these conversations important? So, children typically aren't at a place in their lives where, when they see acts of violence on the news or they see it in their neighborhood or their communities, they don't think that, that could have been me. As adults, we tend to think of, we identify with some of the individuals that violence is directed towards, but children don't tend to think of it in that way. So, for children, they may think of it in the sense of that could have been someone I love. So that could have been my mom, that could have been my brother, that could have been someone that I know in my immediate community. So for African American and Latinx families, many families have the talk with their children, and the talk can be how to engage with police or when police are in around. The talk can be, how they engage in school. So, for my parents, it was you have to work twice as hard to be half as good. And so having that conversation with their children typically happens at an early age. And so this conversation entails, the stereotypes and discrimination that their child may face, as well as how to act when those situations occur. However, these conversations are also important for white families as they provide opportunities for families to discuss, what an ally is and how to be an ally, as well as, white individuals that have stood in solidarity with people of color. And this way, so children don't necessarily see white people as just oppressors, but they also see them as, supporters and allies and co-conspirators. So prior to engaging in a conversation with your child, it's important that you recognize and take the time to recognize your own biases. So what is a bias? So bias is, you're showing unfair favoritism towards something or someone. So that can be influenced by your culture, that can be influenced by experiences with your family, how, you see other cultures viewed on the media. And so what does that look like? So for example, if someone has a bias that favors women, they may only hire women as employees for a job. Well, the opposite could also be true. So if someone has a bias against women, they would not hire a woman, they would only hire a man over a woman that might be more qualified for that position. And so there are different types of biases. So the first is the confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is when we pay more attention to information that confirms our existing belief system. So that means that we're ignoring information that opposes those beliefs. The attribution bias means that we're providing the benefit of the doubt or second chances for behavior or circumstances for those that are similar to ourselves. So if someone of a similar race or ethnicity does something that, we might identify as being morally wrong, we might give them a second chance to say, oh, they didn't really mean to do that, or, it wasn't that bad. So kind of making an excuses and making a second chance for their behavior, justifying their behavior. The availability bias means that you're relying on immediate examples to come to mind. So for example, when you think of a leader, when you think of CEOs of companies, people tend to think of those as being male. And so they're often surprised when those are female. And then finally, the affinity bias. So the affinity bias is a tendency to build relationships with those we consider to be more like ourselves. So we gravitate towards those that are of similar race, similar ethnicity, have similar beliefs, similar perspectives. So that is an example of affinity bias. So then there's also the difference between explicit versus implicit bias. So explicit bias means that that you're aware of the fact that you have these biases and that you're able to admit that both to yourself as well as other people. Whereas implicit biases, they're a little bit more subtle and that they're harder to detect and it may be subconscious. It's not an intentional bias. However, when you take time to reflect and really think through some of your actions and behaviors, you might realize that you have some of these biases. So when you're confronting your biases, so according to Nolte in 2016, confronting biases is important in order to increase your awareness of them, but also to begin to change your behaviors. So in terms of increasing your awareness, you can begin to ask yourself, why am I bothered by this group of people? Why is this something that I care about? So again, thinking about that self-reflection aspect and starting to ask yourself questions about, why do you engage in certain behaviors? Why do you have certain lines of thinking directed towards a certain group of people? And in that, you can make yourself more aware of your biases. And then behavior. So you're going to start to retrain your brain by paying attention to your thoughts and behaviors. So you're going to be mindful of the fact that, you may jump to conclusions about a person or a group. And so with this, you're going to start to engage in mindfulness exercises prior to engaging in activities that may trigger certain stereotypes. So you're allowing yourself to calm down, take deep breaths, kind of sit in that moment and calm your brain and your body before you engage in a situation that may be triggering for you. Then you're going to participate in relationships with those of other social identities. So similar to the affinity bias where, you are surrounded by individuals that are similar to yourself, you're going to try to branch out and step outside of that and interact with those that might be different from you in any way in terms of, again, race, ethnicity, class. So any way that they may be different from you because they have a different perspective. So you're going to start to build relationships with those individuals. And then finding similarities between yourself and those that are different from you. Again, so those that are different cultures, that may be in any way different from yourself, finding the ways in which you are similar and kind of building upon those in order to build those and sustain those relationships. And finally, looking at life from the other person's shoes. So really walking a mile in their shoes, kind of seeing their experience from their eyes, and that may shift the way you view that group of people or that individual. So throughout this presentation, I want you to consider, what are some biases that may have an impact on your child? Have you yourself experienced bias? And then how might biases affect our lives? I really want you to take some time and kind of keep those questions in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of these slides. So modeling. Modeling is really critical when engaging with children. And so keeping in mind that your child is paying attention to how you respond to conversations about race. So if it appears that you're uncomfortable or you're nervous or you're anxious when you're engaging in these conversations, your child is more likely to think that these conversations and these topics are a negative thing and they're not going to ask you about it. They're not going to ask questions about it anymore. They're not going to want to talk about it with you because they see that you're uncomfortable and they're going to kind of feed off that energy. And so your child also notices, your behavior and the words that you have towards others. So if you say or they hear you say discriminatory remarks or you demonstrate fear, anger towards a group of people, your child is more likely to pick up on that and also kind of, demonstrate that same behavior. So in essence, you want to model how you want your child to respond and interact with people that are different from themselves, because a lot of what they learn comes from, the behaviors of their family and their parents. So those in their immediate circle. And so it's really important that you have a good grasp of the vocabulary that is being used at this current time. So before you talk to your child, make sure you're well versed in the terms that are associated with race, as well as the current civil rights movement, such as social justice, protest, police brutality, discrimination, ally, oppression. And so all of these terms are really critical to keep in mind and to be able to define for yourself so that you're able to kind of modify that language for the developmental level of your child. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the actual strategies for talking with your child about race. So the first is practice makes progress. And I intentionally put progress because this conversation at no point is ever going to be perfect. In this conversation, you're continuing to build your skills, you're continuing to learn. And so it'll be never be a perfect conversation, but it'll be progress towards that. So you're going to practice what you want to say first. And so again, I don't deny that these conversations can be uncomfortable, and they can also be anxiety provoking for anyone. And so it may be helpful for you to practice what you're going to say to your child with another adult, or practice it, a trusted adult, or practice it in the mirror. So that way you kind of get a sense of the language you're going to use, the flow, and then try to imagine questions that your child may ask you and practice answering them. And it's perfectly okay to, when your child asks the question, to say that you don't know. That provides the space and opportunity for you to research and learn together. But you do want to kind of get a sense of the questions that they may come up with, that you're able to answer as much as you possibly can. Creating a safe space. So this is really critical to do when engaging with your child. So conversation about race, again, can produce a variety of emotions that can range from sadness to anger, confusion, frustration. So you want to take the time to let your child know that their feelings are normal and their feelings are important. So really validating how they feel in that moment. So allow them to express their feelings fully and meet those feelings with compassion, understanding, instead of judgment, or frustration and concern. So really being empathetic and compassionate to what they're communicating to you. And you're going to acknowledge that, speaking about these topics may also have an impact on you emotionally. So allowing them to see that it also impacts you further normalizes how they feel in that moment. So using metaphors and analogies. You can begin to have the conversation about race and civil rights movement using metaphors and analogies that children can understand, because that may make it more meaningful for them and more impactful. The conversation may be more impactful. So for example, imagine if you broke your leg and had to go to the doctor. So you want the doctor to know that your leg hurts. So all of your bones matter, but right now your leg needs attention. So similar to the Black Lives Matter movement. So that can be an analogy to kind of describe how, yes, all lives do matter, but in this moment, we are focusing on Black lives. So that can be a way or an example that you can use to have your child understand the correlation between the two. Another example is like when you get in trouble for something your friend did and you protest by saying no, that's a form of a peaceful protest. So that's a way to kind of describe to your child, why people are protesting in the streets, kind of explaining peaceful protest to them in a way that is more feasible and understanding for them, given a situation that they may encounter in their own life. Simplifying the language. Again, so you want to make sure that the language that you use with your child is both age and developmentally appropriate as much as you possibly can. So I understand that these concepts are extremely complex. I do not at all deny that. But you want to ensure that the information you're talking about is going to be understood by your child. Otherwise, it's going to go over their head and the conversation is not as productive as you may have wanted it to be. So for example, if you're discussing a topic such as police brutality, so you're going to really break it down to your child in a way that they understand, depending on their developmental level. So if you have a child that is in high school, their conversation would look very different from the conversation you have with your child that might be in kindergarten. So in discussing police brutality, you're going to ask your child what they think police officers do. Explain to them that while police officers should be helpful and kind, that may not always be true. And so you're going to take the time to explain that, police officers may engage in actions that are hurtful to people of color or people with disabilities. And so you're leaving room for your child to then process what they just heard and ask questions. So that might be an example of a conversation that you have with your child that is in elementary school, about elementary age. So really breaking those concepts down for them. So to make sure that it's completely understood when they walk away from the conversation. Poems and rhymes. So this is also a really good way to communicate some of this information to your child, and that it's dependent on the age and developmental level as well. So Greg 2017 created a poem for parents to use in teaching their child what to do if they have an encounter with a police officer to ensure that they remain safe. So the word is alive, where A stands for always use your manners, L stands for listen and comply, I stands for in control of your emotions, V stands for visible hands only, and E stands for explain everything. So for example, if you're reaching for your wallet, explaining that to a police officer. So you can create something like this for and with your child, so that again they're deeper, have a more deeper connection to what you're talking about. Or you can find some of these kind of things on the internet. So just something that's really short and sweet, and it kind of communicates the information in a way that they're going to be able to remember it. So when using poems such as this, you can practice the actions with your child until your child becomes familiar with them. So in the case of the Alive poem, you can go step by step and kind of practice with your child what that would look like, what it will look like to use your manners when you're talking to the police, what it will look like to listen and comply, or what it would look like to have your hands be visible. So walking them through step by step each action until they become familiar with them. So it provides you with the opportunity to explain what can happen if these steps are not followed and why these steps are important. So that provides you a door or window into kind of connecting this to current events as well. And then starting with fairness. So beyond simplifying the language and using the rhymes with your child, you want to start with fairness. And that might be an easy way to kind of explain some of these difficult ideas that are associated with race, particularly for younger children. So you're going to provide your child with examples or scenarios that are fair or not fair, because that might be a little bit easier for them to grasp onto and to understand. So you're going to explain to them, for example, that cases such as what happened to Breonna Taylor or George Floyd are examples of cases that were not fair. And so you're going to indicate the importance of fairness both for yourself and for your family. And so you're going to make explanations as personal as possible. So creating scenarios that the child may see in the home, the child may see when they're engaging with yourself or other family members. So that'll bring it closer to home for them, making it more impactful, making it more memorable, and increases the likelihood that when they walk away from this conversation, they will have that situation or scenario in the back of their mind to reference. And then tools to use. So books, toys, and media can be a great way to begin the conversation about race. And there are plenty of lists and resources online, and I may have some at the end of this PowerPoint that have books that are developmentally appropriate and age appropriate that kind of begin to introduce children to, these topics and these concepts. And there's also media that is specifically designed for children, and there are also a lot of online resources specifically designed for children that have videos, that have worksheets, and activities that kind of engage children in these concepts in a way that can be understood by them. So you really want to begin to diversify the books and the TV shows and movies that are accessible in your home. And so you'll probably realize when certain groups are frequently highlighted in those media that I just described. And so by including more diverse media, you'll start to change who your children perceive as friends, neighbors, and heroes. And so you want to really shift that narrative for them and start to have TV shows that or books or movies that highlight diverse populations of individuals. So they're not only seeing one race and identifying one race as, leaders and heroes, neighbors, or friendly individuals. You want them to be able to identify that with individuals of multiple races, of multiple cultures, and particularly for books. So utilizing books that celebrate diversity and show people of color in normal situations. So you don't just want to have books that focus on injustice or enslavement or discrimination or the things that have negatively impacted people of color. You want to have books that kind of highlight the amazing things that people of color have done, highlight their stories, so that children get that balance and they're not just focused on the negative aspects of it. Videos, social stories, and visual aids can also be extremely useful in showing the difference among people, as well as modeling how to appropriately engage with people that may look different than your child. And so social stories are particularly important because it provides the opportunity for the child to see themselves and their name included in these scenarios. So again, it makes it more memorable because they feel more personally connected to what's going on. And if possible, purchasing toys that have characters of diverse backgrounds. So if your child is into dolls, if your child's into Barbies, or just any other toy, trying to accommodate the more diverse populations. So there's not just like one type of doll that exists in your home setting, or one type of toy that exists in your home setting. Pay attention and look out for value judgments. So, children at a young age will begin to make observations about how they are different from the people around them. And there's no harm in them making, observations such as, that man is brown, that man is this color, or that woman has curly hair. There's no harm in that, but you want to pay attention to if your child begins to place judgment on those differences. So, say, for example, if your child begins to say, well, the brown man is not as good as the white man, or the one with the curly hair isn't as pretty as the woman with the straight hair. So, if that happens, you can begin to ask your child questions such as, maybe, why do you think that? Or what makes you say that? So that way you can understand where they're coming from and understand their thinking behind it. And then again, use it as a lesson and a way to communicate A, what stereotypes are, and B, how certain words can be hurtful. So they can understand that, this may not be the best way to approach individuals that look different from themselves, but really getting them to understand and appreciate those differences of other people. So affirmation, correction, and protection. So according to Stevenson 2016, the following is a 3-step plan that can be used when having a conversation with your child. So affirmation means you're celebrating the aspects of your child that make them different from the dominant culture. So particularly for children of color, you're celebrating all the different features that make them different from their friends. So that could be their hair, their skin color, their body type, anything that makes them different from the dominant culture, really validating and making them feel beautiful and amazing for those differences. Correction. So correction is, if possible, ask your child what they already know about race and issues related to race. So engaging in that conversation with your child and correcting any misinformation. So anything that you feel like, that's not quite right, or they're almost there in your thinking, but providing a little bit more of a base for them and understanding than the information they may have previously received. And finally, protection. So continuing to check in with the emotional state of your child, both before, actually not both, but before, during, and after the conversation. So letting them know that this is a conversation that you're going to continue to have. This is not going to be one conversation, but it's going to be ongoing. And there's going to be different situations that are going to come up that are going to kind of shift this conversation, but letting them know that at any point, different feelings may come up and those feelings are okay. So really checking in with how they're feeling about the conversation, how they're feeling about the content. So making sure that you're aware of their feelings throughout this dialogue. When speaking with your children, you definitely want to refrain from using the colorblind approach. So according to Williams 2011, being colorblind means that the best way to end discrimination and injustice is by treating everyone the same way without any attention to differences in race, culture, or ethnicity. However, color blindness has a negative impact on people of color because it erases the negative experience that they may have faced. It rejects their culture and ignores the different perspectives that they may hold. So it kind of erases the nuances of people of color. So race has a significant impact on how people of color navigate society. And so the colorblind approach is rooted in white privilege, as they may not be aware of how race impacts people of color. So instead of having the colorblind approach, it's better to be more multicultural by acknowledging and celebrating racial and cultural differences. And that way, you're also paying attention to, actions and the historical impact of people of color without erasing it. But, you're acknowledging the fact that there are differences amongst yourselves. So teaching a child how to be an ally is a critical aspect of conversations about race. So what is an ally? An ally is a member of the dominant or majority group that advocates for and in support of an oppressed or minority population. So examples of members of the dominant group are individuals that are white, middle class, or heterosexual. That list is not exhaustive, but that is examples. And similarly, examples of members of oppressed populations are pretty much all other racial and ethnic groups, such as African American, Latinx, Asian, etc., individuals that are LGBTQIA, individuals that are of low income, and individuals that may have disabilities. How can children become allies? So you're encouraging your child to speak up against racism. You're not expecting them to completely understand what it's like to experience racism, especially at a young age. But instead, you want to help your child kind of adopt the mantra of if you see something, say something. So, in that way, if you're encouraging your child to stand up and speak out if they notice that someone around them is being treated unfairly. And that kind of goes back to the conversation about the difference between what's fair and what's not fair. So you're inspiring them to be brave and to communicate with authority figures around them about injustice or about unfairness and to have a conversation about what that looks like in order to support their friends or whoever it is that they see being treated in an unjust way. So you're assisting them in acknowledging that while they may be sad or feel pain because they just witnessed something that they felt was unfair, but this particular conversation is not about them. They weren't the individual that was being treated unfairly. They weren't the individual that the act was directed towards, but they're in fact supporting that individual. So they have every right to feel sad or to feel pain, but the conversation really is about the person that was treated unfairly. It's about finding support and advocating for that person in that moment. So promoting ally behavior. So you really want to model treating others with respect and empathy, as well as how you'll intervene on behalf of others. So you're explaining to your child that it may not always be comfortable or safe to directly intervene on behalf of other individuals, but it may be better instead to talk to someone who is trained to help. So if they see something happening on the schoolyard, or if they see something, happening in their community, finding someone who may be trained to help in the event that it's not safe. And so that can be a teacher, some kind of authority figure, someone, or just someone else, another body to support them in that moment. So have your children practice by providing them with scenarios. And this could be, again, through a social story that includes, their own name and their picture in it. So it makes it more personal. Or it can be reading a book with them, or just creating a scenario and having a conversation about it or a discussion about it and asking them how they will respond in that moment. And so it allows children to recognize their own privilege and then how they would react and act when supporting someone who does not have those same privileges. So this is just the overall summary of tips and recommendations. So first is facing your own biases. So really taking the time to confront your own biases before engaging in this conversation. Educate yourself. And so that could be through reading articles, listening to podcasts, watching videos. There are a multitude of resources out there at this point to kind of begin to dive into the research and education aspect before engaging with your child, to make sure that you have all the information necessary to have a comprehensive conversation. Acknowledge that this is not a marathon. It is a marathon, not a sprint. So this is an ongoing conversation. It's not just going to be one conversation and then you're going to be done. There are going to be plenty of things that are going to come up over time that your child is going to have questions about, that they're going to want to talk about. So this is going to be an ongoing process for them. So don't limit yourself or your thinking to this is going to be one conversation and we're never going to bring it up again. Make sure that the books, videos, TV shows, and movies that your child engages with highlights diversity. Again, making sure that it doesn't only highlight the majority culture or a single culture, but involves different individuals of different cultures. So they have a little bit more diversity in their thinking and what they're consuming. Don't pretend to have all the answers. If there's something you don't know, own that. As I said previously, if you don't know something, tell your child, I don't know that at this point, but use that as a time to research. Use it as a time to go back through those books and articles and videos and learn with your child. So that's something that I don't know about. Let's learn about that together. And have a conversation about privilege. Have a conversation, even for people of color, have a conversation about privilege. Discuss your social privileges and how that may separate yourself from other individuals that don't have those privileges. So making your child aware of those privileges and how they can change their behavior now that they know about those privileges. Utilize language that is age and developmentally appropriate. This is extremely critical to make sure that your child understands the conversation. If you use language that is not age developmentally appropriate, it increases the likelihood that they're not going to walk away from that conversation gaining anything from it. It would clear over their head. So really want to use the language that targets them specifically. Create a safe space for discussion. So you really want to make sure that your child understands that their feelings are going to be validated, their feelings are normal, that they're going to be able to come to you and have a conversation where they will not be judged for what they're going to communicate, but that you're going to meet them with compassion and understanding. And then finally, encourage your child to be an ally. So encourage your child to stand up and speak out or act out in support of other individuals. So this is a quote from Rosa Parks: is to bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. We will fail when we fail to try. So this is to motivate you that this is scary. This can be nerve-wracking. This can be anxiety producing, but this is a first step into making change. So failure, it should not be on your radar at this point. It's okay to make mistakes in this process. No one is perfect in this conversation, but you're making the step to involve your children and have, a meaningful conversation with them. And that alone is something that you should be applauded for and validate yourself for and affirm yourself for that action. So definitely take the time to engage in this step, because it's more than just if you did nothing and didn't engage your child in this conversation, particularly in this moment when there's so much going on in our local and larger communities. And these are some of the resources that are linked to some of what I was talking about, but also have activities, information. There's books or things specifically for different age groups. There's things for individuals that have disabilities, individuals that are at different developmental stages. So these are just resources that I utilize, but also resources that you guys can access in order to get some of these videos, books, and TV shows that I was referencing throughout the presentation. And that is it.